Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 355. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to cover on today's show, but first I want to tell everyone that we are kicking off our winter fund drive at the Libertarian Institute. So if you'd like to help myself, Scott Horton, Jim Bovard, and the host of great writers, podcasters, authors that we have at the Libertarian Institute continue to produce high quality work for y'all, please head on over to Libertarian Institute today and make a donation. I'm mostly focusing on the war in Ukraine on today's show. I took off the Friday show to celebrate Thanksgiving, so I hope you all had a nice long weekend, and we have quite a bit of news to get through today on the war, so I'll get to that very quickly. Just want to remind people to share the show. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere people listen to podcasts, and then you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. That's going to save you 20% off when you spend $75 or more. And they have a fantastic lineup of products at Paloma Verde. Check it out. Again, help out the show, help out yourself. Use the promo code PEACE when you check out. Now let's get into the news. The first story from today I wrote for the Libertarian Institute yesterday, September 27th. And this one is titled 20 NATO states are pretty tapped out after weapon transfers to Ukraine. And I write, 2/3 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have depleted their stockpiles by sending weapons to Kiev, according to an alliance official. Even larger NATO states are struggling to meet the demands of Ukraine's war effort. The New York Times reported on Sunday that the North Atlantic Alliance is struggling to meet Kiev's battlefield needs, according to one NATO official. 20 out of 30 members are, quote, pretty tapped out regarding their ability to supply Ukraine with additional weapons, while larger states like the United States, France, Germany, and Italy have the ability to arm Ukraine, but those governments have resisted sending specific weapon systems requested by Kiev. Ukraine has sought long-range surface-to-surface missiles known as ATACMS from Washington. However, the White House has rebuffed the request out of concerns the munitions could be used to hit Russian territory. Those have a range of, I think, about 200 kilometers. Part of the cause of the dwindling arms supply is the massive demand for artillery. Currently, Ukrainian forces are firing thousands of rounds of artillery per day, but the U.S. can only produce 15,000 rounds per month. Camille Grand, a defense expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations, told the New York Times, a day in Ukraine is a month or more in Afghanistan. And one of the things in this New York Times article, they kind of go over that I didn't spend a whole lot of time on in my article just because I didn't think it was that important. But they're saying, like, you know, the U.S. defense industry is built to produce weapons for the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. war in Syria, which doesn't require a whole lot of U.S. munitions, a whole lot of U.S. artillery. Now that we have this massive artillery war in Ukraine, all of these U.S. weapon systems that we've, put in, all of our howitzers that we've given to Ukraine require U.S. artillery. Well, unfortunately, our ability to only produce a few of those every day means that Ukraine is using more than the U.S. could possibly produce. Also, even though the U.S., France, and all these other countries have sent Ukraine different artillery systems that, they made, the French sent theirs, the U.S. sent theirs, Norway sent theirs, etc., there's not a lot of swappability, there's probably a better word for it, in the NATO arsenals, right? And so it's not like you could put a 155 millimeter howitzer round from a U.S. system into all the other European systems. And so this has, created a lot of problems for the Ukrainian army continuing to use these artillery rounds. The increased, back to the article, the increased demand for weapons has been a significant boom for the Western arms industry. And this is from Sebastian Chilewicz, CEO of Poland's PGZ, an entity that owns multiple arms manufacturers. Taking into account the realities of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the visible attitude of many countries aimed at increasing spending on the battlefield of defense budget, there is a real chance to enter markets and increase export revenues in the coming years. U.S. arms makers are also profiting off the war. In May, during a visit to a Lockheed Martin plant, President Joe Biden said Washington would increase the number of weapons the U.S. would produce. The president said he plans to ramp up production and that would not come cheap. The American arms profiteering has upset some Europeans. According to Politico, one European official said, "The fact is, if you look at this soberly, the country that is most profiting off the war is the United States because they are selling more gas and at higher prices and because they are selling more weapons." Mark F. Kankin, a former White House arms strategist and current senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, agreed it would take a multi-year effort to ramp up production of key weapons. If you increase the production capacity of 155 millimeter shells, it's probably going to be 4 or 5 years before you start seeing them come out the other end. Multiple U.S. and NATO officials said the alliance is committed to Ukraine for the long term as they are preparing to fight a multi-year proxy war against Moscow. In October, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. would boost Ukraine's defense capabilities for pressing urgent needs and for the long term. So, when I read this, it does seem to me that there is a gap between what they are saying and what the reality is. If it's going to take multiple years to get the production of 155 millimeter ammunition ramped up to a level sustainable for the war in Ukraine, what are we going to do for the next 4 to 5 years when Ukraine is trying to use 20,000, 30,000 artillery rounds maybe a day, or a week, and the U.S. is only producing 15,000 a month? Now, obviously, I'm sure they could ramp up production a little bit more, a little bit quicker, but overall, that is the pace. And so how are they going to fill this gap? Also, if they're ramping up this production for that's going to take 5 years, are they really planning on this war taking 5 years? And it really seems to be the case. Now, I want to get into a little bit more of that Politico article, and Dave DeCamp wrote that up for antiwar.com yesterday, titled, "Furious with Biden, Europe says U.S. is profiting off the war in Ukraine." High-level European officials are furious with the Biden administration and are now accusing the U.S. of profiteering off the war in Ukraine while Europe is facing a potential energy crisis. In comments to Politico, a senior EU official said, "The fact is, if you look at it soberly, the most profiteering for the war because the U.S. are selling more gas at higher prices and because they are selling more weapons. The U.S.-led sanctions campaign on Russia has backfired on Europe as it ratcheted up energy prices to the point where Europeans are facing blackouts this winter. On top of the energy situation, European leaders fear they will lose out on investments due to unprecedented subsidies, including in the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, with President Biden signed into law in August. The Inflation Reduction Act included $369 billion in subsidies and tax breaks for green businesses, incentivizing companies to invest in the U.S. instead of Europe. European leaders have publicly criticized the U.S. for the legislation and are considering subsidies of their own, signaling a brand new trade war between the U.S. and Europe here, which is, pretty crazy. These are our, most stalwart allies in our proxy war against Russia. The senior EU official told Politico that the double whammy of high energy prices and loss of trade due to subsidies could turn the public opinion against supporting the war in Ukraine. We are really at a historic juncture, the official said. America needs to realize that a public opinion is shifting in many EU countries. The Politico reports that the Inflation Reduction Act brought by Brussels into full-blown panic mode and is causing European officials to question the reality of the U.S. as an ally. The Inflation Reduction Act has changed everything. Is Washington our ally or not? The EU is also unhappy that it's purchasing American gas at 4 times the cost what it is sold for in the U.S., although the difference in price could be explained by transportation costs and the fact that it is resold by European companies. While the U.S. government doesn't control the price of gas being sold to Europe, the Biden administration did pressure Europe to wean itself off the much cheaper Russian energy, which in turn benefited American gas companies. Despite leading the sanctions campaign against Russia, the U.S. takes no responsibility for the high energy prices, even though President Joe Biden has admitted that the policy would hurt both Americans and Europeans. The biggest beneficiary of Biden's doctrine has been the weapons industry. The U.S. and its allies have shipped tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine. The policy is being led by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, a former Raytheon board member. That has reportedly depleted American weapons stockpiles, leading to long-term contracts to refill those. So, over the past couple weeks, a key discussion that has kept coming up on the show is how serious are the Americans in diplomacy. And the reason for this is we had a couple of stories come out, one being the Americans saying that we're going to encourage the Ukrainians to basically fake interest in diplomacy with Russia and remove some of their diplomatic hard lines out of the goal of increasing their support from Europeans who are getting kind of nervous about how long this war is going on with no resolution in sight. But we also did get some stories out of the White House saying that the White House is encouraging Zelensky to curb some of his hardline positions. And so, it could be a little bit of both here, but my interpretation has been that they're really not interested in peace, just dragging the Europeans along for as long as possible in supporting Ukraine here. So Dave writes on November 23rd, still no sign of peace talks despite increasing U.S.-Russia dialogue. Despite the increase in dialogue between the U.S. and Russia and a shift in messaging from the Biden administration, there has still been no signs of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has continued its heavy strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and the Kremlin said Wednesday that it hasn't had any interaction with the U.S. about the subject of peace talks, according to the Russian TASS news agency. Russia's representative to the UN said that Russia will continue its special military operation until the government of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is ready for talks. The official said Russia will keep up the military pressure until Kiev takes a realistic position which will make it possible to discuss and try to settle those problems which have prompted us to launch a special military operation. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, the highest-ranking military officer in the U.S., has voiced support for a diplomatic solution, but his view is not popular among other Biden administration officials. According to a report from Politico, Milley first made public call for negotiations. The Biden administration reassured Ukraine that peace talks don't need to happen and that they would continue supporting the fight against Russia. All right. So last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, was the actual missile strike. But over the past couple weeks, another key story has been the potential of a Russian missile, a missile fired by Moscow, actually landing in Poland and killing 2 people. It was pretty quickly, realized that the AP report about that was incorrect, and that it was the Ukrainian air defense missile that landed in Poland and caused this destruction. But this has caused some other things to happen, and one of those was Germany offered Poland Patriot missiles, which Poland has apparently rebuffed. So Dave DeCamp writes on November 24th, the Polish government has rebuffed an offer from Germany to deploy Patriot air defense missiles to Poland by suggesting they should be sent to Ukraine instead, which would significantly escalate NATO's involvement in the war against Russia. Sending the Patriots to Poland would require deploying German troops to operate them, which would mean direct NATO intervention in the war. German defense minister rejected the idea on the grounds that Ukraine is not a NATO member. These are Patriot systems as a part of the integrated NATO air defense planning. That's why it was possible to make the offer to Poland. Any proposal that deviates from that must now be discussed with NATO allies. So hopefully this doesn't move forward, and Poland just was maybe even concerned that getting the Patriot missiles would give the Biden administration an excuse to either remove or not deploy as many of the Aegis Ashore missile systems. And remember, the Aegis Ashore versus the THAAD could fire Tomahawk missiles and the MK-41 launchers. So Patriot missiles have their own launchers, their own systems, and while it is the goal of the U.S. defense industry to, the Pentagon to, I think, eventually replace the Patriots with a missile system that has a launcher that's far more universal than the current one. Currently, Patriots cannot fire offensive missiles out of their silos where the Aegis Ashore can. Worse, as far as at least the Russian perspective, is that the Aegis Ashore launchers can fire missiles that are tipped with, could be tipped with nuclear weapons. And so my guess is the only reason that Poland would have rejected the offer for Patriots is because they were concerned it could hurt them somewhere else. All right, moving on here. A bipartisan group of senators is pressing the Pentagon to give Ukraine advanced drones. A group of bipartisan senators is urging the Biden administration to provide Ukraine with advanced MQ-1C Gray Eagle drones that would give Kiev longer range capabilities. The Biden administration has been hesitant to send the drones due to the risk of escalation with Russia and the concerns that sensitive technology in the drones could end up in the wrong hands. The Wall Street Journal recently reported the Biden administration has decided not to provide the drones, although other reporting disputed that claim and said the final decision hasn't been made. In the letter, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, 16 senators expressed concern over reports that the administration declined to give the drones to Ukraine, and the senators asked the administration to give careful reconsideration to the Ukrainian request. The letter was led by Republican Joni Ernst, who is again, Republican from Iowa, and then it was also signed by members of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, including ranking member Jim Inhofe, who has quite a bit of influence. So while maybe, not for sure that, this is going to happen, it does seem like we're getting closer and closer, although maybe the one positive we have is the U.S. just being too afraid that the technology will fall into Russia's hands after it gets shot down by the Ukrainians, and that's why we won't get it. Also, I would imagine that they're somewhat concerned that this could be used to attack Russian territory, although I haven't seen any reports of that to know for sure. Next up, U.S. announces $400 million weapons package for Ukraine. This was the 26th iteration of the presidential drawdown authority being used and equipment being shipped to Kiev. I'm not exactly sure if then this means it's like the 27th package overall, because I know at least one was only using the Ukrainian funding package where they're actually buying contracts and arms and not just shipping them directly from the U.S. stockpiles. So I'm not sure how all this is being counted. But they say they are giving Ukraine additional munitions for their anti-air air defense systems, 150 heavy machine guns with thermal imagery sights to counter unmanned aerial systems, additional ammunition for the HIMARS, 200 precision guided 155 millimeter artillery rounds. I'm not sure if those are the Excalibur rounds or not. 10,000 120 millimeter mortar rounds, high speed anti-radar radiation, or I think they're anti-radar missiles, the HARMS, 150 high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, over 100 light tactical vehicles, over 20,000 small arms and rounds, over 200 generators, small and then spare parts for 105 millimeter howitzers and other equipment. And this package was announced around the same time as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced a new round of $4.5 billion in direct budgetary assistance for the Ukrainian government. Yellen said that the new funds will bring the total of U.S. budgetary assistance for Kiev to $13 billion, and that is more coming as Ukraine is expected, needs massive help from the U.S. to meet its budget deficit for the year 2023. It's like a $30 billion deficit. So my guess is that this number is probably going to double in 2023 versus 2022. This is absolutely astounding. It does say that the aid is being distributed through the U.S. And the World Bank, according to USAID. The funds will be sent to Ukraine in two tranches before the end of the year. The budgetary aid is meant to fund Ukraine's government and services. I would really like to see some very good oversight and accounting on this money. With Ukraine being in the state it's in, I would not be surprised if a lot of this money is just being stolen. Also, for Americans, we're talking about $45 billion over 2 years. What could that money have gone to in the United States? I just saw this morning that Houston apparently had to cancel their schools because they don't have clean water and all the residents had to boil water. So we could probably fix water infrastructure in this country, or as a libertarian, just give people, let them keep more of their own money. Biden says negotiations on Russian oil price caps are in play. This is pretty important, and the deadline for this is coming up in a week now, so I'm really surprised we have not gotten the actual number here. My guess is that the Europeans aren't very happy with this, and that's why we haven't gotten the number yet. But that's just my speculation. But Dave DeCamp writes here, President Biden on Thursday said negotiations between the U.S. and its allies to set a price cap on Russian oil are in play as the December 5th deadline to implement the plan is approaching. December 5th is the day the EU's embargo on Russian oil takes effect. Although there are exemptions for some countries, including Hungary, the oil embargo includes a ban on providing insurance for Russian oil shipments. The idea of the price cap is to curb Russian oil profits without taking Russian oil off the market by allowing insurance and other services to continue as long as the crude oil is sold at a price set by the West. But the plan is almost certainly doomed to fail, as it requires Russia's cooperation, and Moscow is warning that it will cut off any country that participates in the price cap, and Russia retaliates by cutting oil production. It could send global prices skyrocketing. Industry experts also say that enforcing the plan will be difficult, as it will be hard for insurance companies to know what the price of oil really is being sold at. We have frequently stated that the implementation of the so-called Russian oil price caps is anti-market policy that disrupts supply chains and can severely exacerbate the situation on global energy markets. Russia does not intend to supply oil that will join the buyer's cartel, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Thursday. According to a report from the New York Times, the U.S. has allowed the EU to lead in determining what the price cap will be set at. EU officials are scheduled to discuss on Thursday. Reports that the EU has been looking at a price between $65 and $70 a barrel. Over the price, Russian crude has been traded between, over the past 3 months, Russian crude has been traded between $65 and $75 per barrel. So, they're kind of setting the price cap maybe at a number so low that or so high that it's really not going to have any effect. And also we know that India and China are not going to be subject to the price caps. And so it seems very likely to me that India will continue to buy oil from Russia and then just resell that to the Europeans. And that's just going to go on at pace. Now, a couple of stories here on the potential for NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. The first is about Hungary, and Hungary says that for a state to join NATO, they had to have the approval of all other member states. In this case, there are 30, and Sweden and Finland have a joint NATO bid. So each of these 30 countries has to approve, one approval for both countries to join. Right, so, in the particular situation with Turkey, which is one of the two countries along with Hungary that haven't given approval, I think they have said that it's Finland who they feel is actually meeting the obligations set forth in the trilateral agreement between Ankara, Oslo, and Helsinki, or Ankara, Stockholm, and Helsinki, and, that it would be fine for Finland to join NATO, but Sweden isn't meeting those commitments. And because it's a joint bid, Turkey isn't going to approve both, right? So in the case with Hungary, Hungary has really moved slowly here, and I haven't really read a lot of statements from Hungary saying that they're not going to approve NATO membership, and now we have the president saying that they're going to improve the NATO membership early next year. The timing of this is interesting, as NATO was really shooting for a Christmas deadline to get these two countries approved, although even if Hungary does give approval, there still is Turkey. And then Finland, this is from Dave DeCamp on December 21st. Finland sees Istanbul bombing as potential hindrance for NATO talks with Turkey. Finland's foreign minister said Saturday that last week's bombing in Istanbul, which Ankara has blamed on the Kurdish military group PKK, could hinder talks with Turkey on joining NATO. Turkey has held up Finland and Sweden's NATO bid over alleged support for the PKK and other Kurdish groups. Ankara is seeking the extradition of suspected PKK members, mostly from Sweden, and has said the Nordic nations have yet to fulfill their deal they signed with Turkey on joining NATO. Finnish foreign minister said the Istanbul bombing, which killed 6 people, will make Turkey want to raise the issue of terrorism even more. It is a momentarium that Turkey is using, and of course they have the right to raise the issues during the NATO process, he said, according to Bloomberg. In response to the Istanbul bombings, Turkey has launched major airstrikes in northern Syria and Iraq. Turkish officials have blamed the violence on the U.S. and other Western countries for supporting the Kurdish groups, which they have been doing for over a decade now. The U.S. initial policy for the war in Syria 2010-2011 is to support the Sunni resistance to Bashar al-Assad, which of course becomes Al-Qaeda and ISIS and starts cutting off the heads of American journalists and all kinds of other really terrible things. 500,000 people have died in this war. And after that kind of blew up in the faces of the Americans, they shifted their policy to supporting the Kurdish groups in Syria, particularly the YPK. And these Kurdish groups, in the view of Turkey, are the same. The PKK, the Syrian Kurds are all the same groups, and they just move freely across the border. This has caused Turkey to invade Syria. They occupy the Idlib province. They occupy, I think, like 5 to 10 kilometers along the Syrian-Turkish border inside Syria, inside Kurdish territory. They occupy the Afrin province of Syria, which is a northern province of the northern Aleppo region and of Syria that was Kurdish dominated, and the Kurds were essentially ethnically cleansed from that area by the Turks. So the U.S. has some issues with the Turkish policy, including the Pentagon saying that Turkish airstrikes in the region are threatening the safety of U.S. troops, which seems pretty serious. We'll see how this works out. I did read today on antiwar.com, Dave just put out a new article saying that the U.S. is trying to mediate the chances that Turkey invades Syria. We also had the White House saying that Turkey has a right to defend themselves from the Kurds, which is interesting since the U.S. is primarily responsible for backing, again, the Kurds in Syria. So the last thing I guess I really want to put on this, and just, for perspective here, we had the war in Ukraine, right, where the U.S. has to, help the Ukrainians, even though there's Nazis within the Ukrainian military and everything like that, because the post-World War II world doctrine says that no country can invade another country. And here we have a NATO member state that's supported by the U.S., that the U.S. regularly deals with, and they have not only invaded Syria, their neighbor, on 3 occasions. They've taken the Idlib province and they back Al-Qaeda there. They've taken the Afrin province and they've expelled the Kurds, and they've taken northern Syria along the border and have pushed the Kurds out of that territory as well. So at what point is the U.S. going to start holding Turkey to the same standard as they hold Russia, and pour billions of dollars of weapons into the arms depots of Bashar al-Assad to fight off the Turkish invaders? Obviously, that's not going to happen, but it's essentially the same situation where we're getting, the complete opposite response from the U.S. Last story today, very interesting news. U.S. grants Chevron license to pump oil again in Venezuela. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The U.S. has granted Chevron a limited license to restart pumping oil in Venezuela in the most significant easing of sanctions on the country since the harsh measures were imposed by the Trump administration. The move came after the government of Venezuela and the President Nicolas Maduro signed a deal with the opposition coalition to allot $3 billion in Venezuelan funds frozen by the U.S. and European banks. Under the deal, the Europeans will go towards humanitarian and economic development projects. According to the Treasury Department, the license granted to Chevron prohibits the Venezuelan state oil company from receiving profits from any sale by Chevron. The license is only limited to Chevron and does not allow other companies to work with the Venezuelan oil company. So, I mean, we'll see how far this goes. I guess it's probably just the first step, and if it's implemented correctly, it could lead to more steps. But in its current, what we're currently seeing here, I'm not very optimistic that this is going to, improve the lives of the Venezuelan people at all, or really lead to a long-term reduction of tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela. But we'll see. We now also have to worry that the new election season is coming up, and I think we're going to start hearing rhetoric, particularly from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who I think is going to make a real push to become president. That Biden's looking weak on Venezuela, and he's appeasing the communist government and all this other stuff. When really, we're just trying to normalize relations and do business, right? That's what we believe in: free markets and enterprise and things like that. And buying Venezuelan oil is good, right? Like, we should be buying it if it's going to decrease energy prices in the U.S. and make the standard of living for Americans better. But that's not the goal of Republicans. It's just to dominate the world in whatever way they want. So that'll wrap up for the show today. Everybody, thank you so much. And just a quick reminder, if you can, check out the Libertarian Institute and help us out, give a little donation, and it'll really help us to continue doing all the work we've been doing. Thanks, guys.